Hi, welcome back to Summer Reading Nights. We are almost done with this book. Can you believe it? We have a couple more chapters to go, so let's see what happens at the end. This next chapter is called Mr. Jenkins and His Son. Mr. Jenkins remembers Bruno's dad. Mr. Jenkins came striding up to our table with a very purposeful look on his face. "Where is that grandson of yours?" he said to my grandmother. He spoke rude and looked very angry. My grandmother put on her frostiest look but didn't answer him. "My guess is that he and my Bruno are up to some devilment," Mr. Jenkins went on. "Bruno hasn't turned up for his supper, and it takes a lot to take that boy to miss his food." "I must admit he has a very healthy appetite," my grandmother said. "My feeling is that you're in on this as well," Mr. Jenkins said. "I don't know who the devil you are, and I don't much care, but you played a nasty trick on me and my wife this afternoon. You put a dirty little mouse on the table. That makes me think all three of you are up to something, so if you know where Bruno's hiding, kindly tell me at once." "That was no trick I played on you," my grandmother said. "That mouse I tried to give you was your own little boy, Bruno. I was being kind to you. I was trying to restore him to the bosom of his family. You refused to take him in." "What the blazes do you mean, madam?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "My son isn't a mouse." His black mustache was jumping up and down like crazy as he spoke. "Come on, woman, where is he? Out with it." The family at the table nearest to us all had stopped eating and were staring at Mr. Jenkins. My grandmother sat there puffing away calmly at her black cigar. "I can well understand your anger, Mr. Jenkins. Any other English father would be just as cross as you are. But over in Norway, where I come from, we are quite used to these sort of happenings. We have learned to accept them as part of everyday life." "You must be mad, woman," said Mr. Jenkins. "Where is Bruno? And if you don't tell me once, I shall summon the police." "Bruno is a mouse," my grandmother said. "He most certainly not a mouse," shouted Mr. Jenkins. "Oh, yes, I am," Bruno said, poking his head out of the handbag. Mr. Jenkins leapt about 3 feet into the air. "Hello, Dad," Bruno said. He had a silly sort of mousy grin on his face. Mr. Jenkins' mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in his black teeth. "Don't worry, Dad. It's not as bad as all that. Just as long as the cat doesn't get me." "Bruno," staggered Mr. Jenkins. "No more school, no more homework. I shall live in the kitchen cupboard and feast on raisins and honey." Bruno," Mr. Jenkins again. "How did this happen?" The poor man had no wind left in his sails. The witches did it. "I can't have a mouse for a son," said Mr. Jenkins. "Well, you've got one. Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins." And this is a picture of the dad finding out where his son is, coming out of the purse. "Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy. She can't stand the things." "She'll just have to get used to him. I hope you don't keep a cat in the house." We do. Topsy is my wife's favorite creature." "Then you'll just have to get rid of Topsy. Your son is more important than your cat." "He certainly is," Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. "You tell Mom she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home." By now half the dining room was watching our little group. Knives and forks and spoons had been put down all over the place. Heads were turning around to stare at Mr. Jenkins as he stood there spluttering and shouting. They couldn't see either Bruno or me, and they were wondering what all the fuss was about. "By the way, would you like to know who did this to him?" There was a mischievous little smile on her face, and I could see she was about to get Mr. Jenkins into trouble. "Who did this? Who did it?" "The woman over there, the small one in the black dress at the head of the long table." "She's RSPCC, cried Mr. Jenkins. "She's the chairwoman." "No, she's not. She's the Grand Hide Witch of all the world." "You mean she did it? That skinny little woman over there?" shouted Mr. Jenkins, pointing at her with the long finger. "By God, I'll have my lawyers on this for her. I'll make her pay through the nose." "I wouldn't do anything rash," said Grandmother. "That woman has magic power. She might decide to turn you into something even sillier than a mouse. A cockroach, perhaps." "Turn me into a cockroach? I'd like to see her try." He swung around and started marching across the dining room towards the Grand Hide Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped up onto our table and was also watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of my grandmother's handbag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put. The next chapter is called The Triumph. Mr. Jenkins had not gone more than a few paces. The Grand High Witch's table, when a piercing scream rose high above all the other noises in the room, and at the same moment I saw the Grand High Witch go shooting up in the air. Now she was standing on her chair, still screaming. She was on the tabletop, waving her arms. "What on earth is happening, Grandmama?" "Wait," my grandmother said. "Keep quiet and watch." Suddenly, all the other witches, more than 80 of them, were beginning to scream and jump out of their seats as those spikes were being stuck into their bottoms. Some were standing on chairs, some were on the tables, and all of them were wiggling about, waving their arms in the most extraordinary manner. Then, all at once, they became quiet. Then they stiffened. Every single witch stood there, as stiff as silent as a corpse. The whole room became deathly still. "They're shrinking, Grandmama. They're shrinking just like I did." "I know they are," my grandmother said. "It's the mouse maker. Look, some of them are growing fur on their faces. Why is it working so quickly, Grandmama?" "I'll tell you why, because all of them have had massive overdoses just like you. It's thrown the alarm clock way out of whack." Everyone in the dining room was standing up now to get a better view. People were moving closer. They were beginning to crowd around the long tables. My grandmother lifted Bruno and me up so we wouldn't miss any of the fun. In her excitement, she jumped up onto her chair so that she could see the heads of the crowd. In another few seconds, all the witches had completely disappeared, and the tops of the two long tables were swarming with small brown mice. All over the dining room, women were screaming and strong men were turning white in the face and shouting, "It's crazy! This can't happen! Let's get the heck out of here quick!" Waiters were attacking the mice with chairs and wine bottles and anything else you came to hand. I saw a chef in the tall white hat rushing out from the kitchen brandishing a frying pan, and another one just behind him wielding a carving knife above his head, and everyone yelling, "Mice, mice, we must get rid of the mice!" Only the children in the room were really enjoying it. They all seemed to know instinctively that something good was going on right there in front of them, and they were clapping and cheering and laughing like mad. "It's time to go. Our work is done," said Grandma. She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno, the time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family. My mom's not very crazy about mice." "So I noticed," my grandmother said. "She'll just have to get used to you, won't she?" It was not difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins' shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert!" It was screaming. "Herbert, get me out of here. There's mice everywhere. They'll go up my skirts." She had her arms high up around her husband from where I'd seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced on them and thrust Bruno onto Mr. Jenkins' hand. "Here's your little boy," she said. "He needs to go on a diet." "Hi, Dad," Bruno said. "Hi, Mom." Mrs. Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in her hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front entrance into the open air. Outside, it was a lovely, warm summer evening, and I could hear the waves breaking on the beach just across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman. "Certainly, madam." He said, and he put 2 fingers into his mouth and blew a whistle. I watched him with envy. For weeks I've been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded once. Now I never would. The taxi came, and the driver was an oldish man with a thick, black, drooping mustache. The mustache hung over his mouth like the roots of some plant. "Where to, madam?" Suddenly he caught sight of me, a little mouse, nestled in my grandmother's hand. "Blimey, what is that?" he said. "Oh, it's my grandson. Drive us to the station, please." I always liked mice," the old taxi driver said. "I used to keep hundreds of them when I was a boy. Mice is the fastest breeders in the world. Did you know that, madam? So if he's your grandson, then I reckon you'll be having a few great-grandsons to go in a couple weeks' time." "Drive us to the station, please," my grandmother said. "Yes, ma'am, right away." My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me on her lap. "Are we going home?" "Yes, back to Norway." "Hooray! Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray. I thought you'd like that. But what about our luggage?" "Who cares about luggage?" The taxi was driving through the streets of Bournemouth, and this was the time of day when the pavements were crowded with holiday makers, all wandering around aimlessly with nothing to do. "How are you feeling, my darling?" "Fine. Quite marvelous," I said. She began stroking the fur on the back of my neck with one finger. "We have accomplished great feats today. It's been terrific. Absolutely terrific." We're going to stop here and we'll go on to the next chapter in the next video.